On a sticky August morning in 1847, the Hartley plantation just outside Richmond, Virginia, went quiet in a way that made the field hands pause mid-motion and lift their heads to listen. Colonel Edmund Hartley had just commanded his only daughter, Margaret, to climb into a horse-drawn wagon alongside Joseph, the most physically powerful man on the entire property. A man capable of hoisting an entire barrel of tobacco leaves over his head as if it weighed nothing at all. That wagon rolled away down the narrow track leading to the old overseer's cabin position near the property line, where the woods grew dense and where the big house disappeared entirely behind curtains of Virginia creeper and wild grape. For a span of 183 days exactly, Margaret and Joseph vanished from sight. When they finally reappeared, Margaret was visibly carrying a child, her face drawn and worn beyond her actual 32 years. Joseph came back inside a pine coffin, pronounced dead by the county physician who attributed it to cerebral fever. The truth about what transpired inside that remote cabin would remain buried for decades until a tin box filled with letters turned up beneath the main house floorboards, exposing a plot so meticulously crafted, so born of desperation, so profoundly dark that it would compel historians to reconsider everything they believed about the Hartley family. Before we dive deeper into Margaret Hartley's story and the chain of events that brought down one of Virginia's most established families, I have a question for you. Can you tell me where you're listening from right this minute? Drop a comment with your state or city. I genuinely enjoy learning where our community of mystery enthusiasts is joining us from. If you're just discovering this channel, please hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear will completely upend whatever you thought you understood about the antebellum South. The reality of what unfolded at Hartley Plantation didn't simply vanish when the colonel passed away. It was deliberately buried, layer upon layer, until someone finally excavated deep enough to bring it to light. Richmond, Virginia during that summer of 1847 carried the unmistakable heaviness of a society transforming under pressures it preferred to ignore. Tobacco had made the city prosperous, that golden leaf creating fortunes in equal measure to the backs it destroyed. The James River carried ship after ship loaded with hogsheads destined for European ports, while the streets bustled with merchants, attorneys, and plantation owners whose entire wealth rested on the labor of human beings they refused to acknowledge as people. This was a universe governed by rigid social codes, where a single whispered rumor could destroy a family's standing, and where women of Margaret Hartley's age and position found themselves squeezed between expectations that could never be met and a reality that offered nothing but cruelty. The Hartley property stretched across 400 acres of rolling Virginia Piedmont, though by 1847 barely half of that land still turned a profit. Years of tobacco cultivation had exhausted the earth, and Colonel Edmund Hartley possessed neither the money nor the imagination to update his methods the way some neighboring planters had done. The main house, a brick Georgian structure his grandfather had built back in 1781, still conveyed an impression of wealth with its white columns and manicured gardens, but anyone paying attention could spot the peeling paint on the shutters and the weeds overtaking the boxwood hedges. Colonel Hartley himself had reached 58 by that summer, a thin man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed far too much brutality during his time in the Mexican-American War. He had returned from that conflict 18 months earlier carrying the rank of colonel plus a restlessness that drove him to pace the grounds after dark, smoking cigars while staring out at the fields as though calculating losses visible only to himself. Margaret's mother had succumbed to cholera back in 1839, leaving him to raise a daughter alone in a society that presented women of her class with precisely two respectable paths forward, marriage or genteel poverty as some relative's dependent spinster. As a child, Margaret Hartley had apparently been quite beautiful, if the family photo album could be believed, but by her 20th year her body had started changing in ways that troubled her father and made her the target of whispered pity throughout Richmond society. Despite his attempts to restrict what she ate, she steadily gained weight until by age 32 she had become what that unkind era termed excessively corpulent, a condition which combined with her advancing years to effectively eliminate her from the marriage pool entirely. 3 proposals had arrived during her early 20s, but her father had turned down each one as insufficient for the family's dignity. By 1847, no proposals came whatsoever. Her days were spent inside the house reading novels her father considered frivolous, playing piano with remarkable talent, and taking extended walks around the plantation grounds whenever the heat inside became unbearable. The enslaved women who worked in the house described her as kind but profoundly lonely, a woman who seemed to be marking time for a life that would never materialize. She possessed a sharp intelligence that discovered no outlet, a depth of feeling that had nowhere to go except inward, where it festered like a wound refusing to heal. Joseph had arrived at the Hartley plantation in 1843, purchased at a Richmond auction for the unusually steep price of $1,200. He was 28 at the time, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with shoulders so broad he needed to turn sideways to squeeze through standard door frames. His previous owner, a struggling planter from Southside Virginia, had rented him out to a railroad construction crew where Joseph built a reputation for working longer and harder than any 3 ordinary men combined. Colonel Hartley acquired him specifically for that physical strength, intending to deploy him for the heaviest labor required on the plantation. But Joseph possessed something far more dangerous than mere physical power. He could read. Someone somewhere in his past had taught him letters and numbers, which counted as a criminal offense in Virginia where teaching enslaved people to read carried fines up to $100. Joseph kept this ability completely hidden, never touching a newspaper or book where others might observe him. The house servants knew, though. They spotted him tracing letters in the dirt behind the tobacco barn. They noticed him studying printed labels on feed sacks with an intensity suggesting he was memorizing far more than just brand names. He spoke quietly and deliberately, maintaining a careful demeanor that showed neither excessive pride nor excessive submission in ways that might invite punishment. The other enslaved men respected him because he never avoided work and never created situations that would draw the overseer's wrath down upon everyone. The colonel valued him as property, good livestock requiring minimal upkeep while delivering maximum output. Margaret had noticed Joseph, though she would later insist she'd barely given him a thought before her father's scheme emerged. She noticed him the way someone notices an impressive horse or a well-crafted piece of furniture, as something remarkable in its construction but fundamentally separate from her own existence. They had exchanged words perhaps 5 times over 4 years, always brief encounters when she happened to cross his path near the stables or the equipment shed. He had struck her with his precise grammatically correct speech, so different from the dialect the colonel expected from his slaves, but she had never imagined him possessing an inner life, complete with dreams or fears or plans. That failure of imagination would later torment her. The summer of 1847 brought brutally oppressive heat, the kind that made the air feel almost solid and transformed the tobacco fields into a shimmering haze. Virginia's political climate mirrored that temperature. Tension simmered over whether slavery would expand into new territories, whispered anxieties about Northern abolitionists circulated constantly, and plantation owners increasingly sensed their entire way of life coming under threat. In Richmond's private clubs and parlors, men discussed theories arriving from Europe about race, heredity, and breeding practices. Books carrying titles like Types of Mankind made their way through educated circles, filled with pseudo-scientific nonsense about racial characteristics and the supposed possibility of improving human stock through controlled reproduction. Colonel Hartley had obtained several such volumes. They sat on a shelf behind his desk in his study, leather-bound and gathering dust while their ideas took root in his increasingly desperate mind. Here was a man watching his family line approach extinction, his fortune dwindle, his daughter sink into permanent spinsterhood. The war had taught him that decisive action, no matter how brutal, could resolve seemingly unsolvable problems. And so, during that sweltering July of 1847, he conceived a plan that would supposedly address multiple difficulties at once. The old overseer's cabin sat roughly a quarter-mile from the main house, concealed behind a dense stand of oak and hickory where the plantation road curved toward the eastern boundary. No one had lived there for 3 years, not since the previous overseer had died of apoplexy, and Colonel Hartley decided he could supervise the plantation personally, saving that $50 monthly salary. The cabin was modest, just 2 rooms connected by a breezeway, constructed from roughly hewn logs with a stone chimney at one end. Field mice had claimed the space, hornets had built nests beneath the eaves, but the roof stayed sound and the walls remained solid. During late July, the colonel ordered 3 enslaved men to clear out the cabin, replaster the chimney, and stock it with supplies. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, preserves, and 2 barrels of water drawn fresh from the well. He had furniture moved from main house storage, a bed frame with rope supports and a corn husk mattress, 2 chairs, a table, cooking pots, oil lamps, and strangely, a substantial number of books from his personal library. The men performing this work said nothing aloud, but they understood that something dark was being prepared. On August 3, 1847, Colonel Hartley summoned Margaret to his study. The conversation that followed was never recorded in its entirety, but its substance became clear through subsequent events and through fragments Margaret would reveal years later to the one person she eventually trusted. The colonel laid out his plan using the cold logic of a military officer. She would reside in that cabin with Joseph for 6 months. During that time, she would become pregnant. The resulting child, assuming it was light-skinned enough, could be raised as white after being presented as an orphan informally adopted by distant Hartley relatives. If necessary, they could repeat this process across multiple generations, gradually whitening the bloodline while preserving the physical vigor the colonel believed enslaved people inherently possessed. To contemporary ears, this sounds utterly insane. But in 1847, within certain circles of the Southern aristocracy, such ideas circulated in whispered conversations. Planters bred their enslaved workers like livestock, sometimes deliberately pairing specific individuals to produce desired traits. Some planters forced enslaved women to become their personal concubines, producing mixed-race children they would later sell or keep as house servants. The colonel's scheme was more systematic, more coldly calculated, but not without precedent in that morally bankrupt society. Margaret's initial reaction went unrecorded. But we know she offered no resistance. Whether this stemmed from shock, from years of conditioning to obey her father absolutely, or from some other calculation entirely, she climbed into that wagon on August 5 without protest. Joseph, given absolutely no choice in the matter, positioned himself as far from her as the wagon bed would allow. His face revealed nothing, but his hands gripped the wagon's side rails with enough force to make the wood creak audibly. The colonel drove them personally, refusing even the company of an overseer. When they reached the cabin, he explained the rules with bureaucratic precision. Joseph would sleep in one room, Margaret in the other. They would receive weekly deliveries of food and supplies left at the cabin's doorstep every Sunday morning. They were absolutely forbidden to leave the cabin or its immediate surroundings. Joseph would be excused from all other work during this period. Margaret would have her books and sewing to occupy her time. The colonel would personally check on them twice each week to verify compliance. What he failed to tell Margaret was that he had promised Joseph his freedom. If Joseph cooperated fully, if a child was conceived and born healthy, the colonel would manumit him within a year and provide funds for passage to Liberia, where the American Colonization Society was resettling freed slaves. This promise, made privately to Joseph the night before their isolation began, served as the lever the colonel used to guarantee compliance. Joseph, who had spent his entire existence as property, was being offered the one thing he had believed impossible. The colonel abandoned them there that August afternoon, the cabin door closing with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut. Margaret stood in the center of the main room, her traveling trunk at her feet, staring at the books the colonel had carefully selected, novels, poetry, scientific treatises. Joseph stood near the door, his small bundle of possessions clutched in one hand, his eyes fixed on the floor. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally Margaret said, "There are 2 rooms. You should take the one in back." Joseph nodded once and disappeared through the breezeway, pulling the connecting door closed behind him. That first night, Margaret sat on the bed fully dressed, listening to the forest sounds pressing in around the cabin, cicadas screaming, owls hunting, small creatures rustling through the undergrowth. She did not weep. She had been raised to consider crying a weakness, and weakness was simply intolerable in a world that crushed the weak without mercy. Instead she opened one of the books her father had provided, a novel by Sir Walter Scott, and read by lamplight until her eyes burned and her mind could finally escape into someone else's story. In the back room, Joseph lay on the corn husk mattress staring at the ceiling beams. He was thinking about freedom, about what it would mean to walk as a man who owned himself. He was thinking about the price attached to that freedom. And he was thinking about the woman in the next room, trapped as completely as he was, though by different chains entirely. The days fell into a pattern that felt both utterly mundane and completely surreal. Margaret woke early, as she always had, and prepared breakfast from the provisions: cornbread, fried salt pork, coffee that tasted strongly of chicory. She would call through the connecting door, and Joseph would emerge, eat quickly at the table, then retreat to his room or go outside to chop wood, repair the fence, or work in the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. They developed an unspoken routine. Meals together, but in silence. Afternoons spent completely separate. Evenings when the heat drove them both to sit on the front porch, where an occasional breeze sometimes penetrated the humid stillness. The Colonel came every Wednesday and Saturday, arriving in late afternoon to conduct what he called inspections. He would question Margaret privately about her health, ask invasive questions about her body, and dispense medical advice drawn from the pseudoscientific literature he had been reading. With Joseph, his conversations remained brief and commanding: orders about maintaining the property, reminders about their agreement, veiled threats about what would happen if Joseph failed to fulfill his end of the arrangement. But something unexpected was developing inside that cabin. Something the Colonel had not anticipated because his understanding of human nature had been warped by years of treating people as property. Margaret and Joseph were beginning to actually talk to one another. It started with practical necessities: coordinating meals, discussing repairs the cabin needed, commenting on the weather. But gradually, carefully, they began sharing more. Margaret discovered that Joseph could discuss the books she was reading because he had secretly read many of them himself. Joseph discovered that Margaret possessed a sharp analytical mind that had been starved for intellectual stimulation. They began playing chess using a set Margaret found in one of the trunks, and she was surprised to find him a skilled player capable of thinking several moves ahead. These conversations remained cautious, bounded by the reality of their situation and the power imbalance society had constructed between them. But within those boundaries, something fragile was being built. Not romance, not during those early weeks, but recognition. Each saw in the other a trapped intelligence, a person imprisoned by circumstances neither had chosen. By late September, Margaret had not become pregnant. The Colonel's visits grew increasingly agitated, his questions more pointed, his implied threats more obvious. He brought medical texts, pointing to passages about fertility and conception. He brought herbal remedies purchased from an apothecary, insisting Margaret take them daily. His desperation was beginning to show through the cracks in his military bearing. It was during this period that Margaret discovered the arsenic. The wallpaper in the cabin's main room featured a once fashionable pattern of dark green leaves against a cream background. It had been installed years earlier when the overseer who lived there had pretensions toward gentility. Margaret had noticed it her first day, admiring the pattern despite the water stains beginning to mar its surface near the ceiling. What she did not know initially was that this particular shade of green, called Shields green, popular during the 1830s and 1840s, contained high concentrations of arsenic trioxide. She learned this from one of the books her father had included in the cabin's small library, a medical compendium discussing common household poisons. The passage described how wallpaper manufacturers used copper arsenite to achieve certain green pigments, and how humid conditions could cause the paper to release poisonous dust, or how it could be scraped into powder. The book noted that arsenic poisoning symptoms included nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle cramping, and in chronic cases numbness, confusion, and death from organ failure. It resembled many natural diseases, particularly fever and cholera, making it difficult to detect without specific chemical tests that most rural physicians never performed. Margaret read this passage 3 times on the night of September 23 by lamplight. While Joseph worked outside repairing a broken shutter, she ran her finger along the seam where 2 strips of wallpaper met near the bed, feeling the slight roughness where humidity had degraded the paste. A greenish dust came away on her fingertip. Why did she take note of this information? What calculation was forming in her mind during those autumn weeks as the leaves began turning and the Colonel's visits grew increasingly tense? These questions would be debated for years after the truth emerged, but the most likely answer is this. Margaret Hartley was beginning to understand that she and Joseph were both being used as instruments in her father's desperate scheme, and that when their usefulness ended, neither of them would simply be allowed to walk away. The Colonel's promise of freedom to Joseph was, Margaret realized, almost certainly a lie. Virginia law in 1847 made manumission extremely difficult, requiring legislative approval except in very specific circumstances. Even if the Colonel somehow secured Joseph's freedom, a free black man in Virginia faced constant danger of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery, a practice that was common and rarely prosecuted. Joseph's knowledge of the Colonel's plan made him a liability, and the Colonel dealt with liabilities through elimination, not emancipation. As for Margaret herself, she saw no future in which her father would permit her to live normally after bearing a mixed-race child, even if that child was raised elsewhere. The shame, the scandal, the questions, all of it would hang over the Hartley family like a thundercloud. Her father might not kill her, but he could easily have her committed to an asylum, a fate that women of her era faced for far lesser transgressions than bearing a child outside marriage. During the first week of October, Margaret began experiencing symptoms that mimicked early pregnancy: morning nausea, fatigue, changes in appetite. She reported these symptoms to her father during his Wednesday visit, and his face transformed with an expression of triumph that made her stomach turn. He brought a physician on his next visit, an elderly doctor from Richmond, who examined Margaret, asked discreet questions, and pronounced it quite possible, though too early for certainty. The Colonel's relief was palpable. He began treating Margaret with an almost manic solicitousness, bringing her delicacies from Richmond, telling her to rest more, to avoid strain. With Joseph, his attitude shifted subtly. He became more cordial, almost friendly, discussing in vague terms how Joseph should prepare himself for significant changes in the coming year. But Margaret was not pregnant. She knew this with certainty because the requirements for pregnancy had not been met. What she was experiencing was the first stage of deliberate arsenic poisoning. Her own poisoning, self-administered in small doses scraped carefully from the wallpaper and mixed into her evening tea. Just enough to produce symptoms that would convince her father his plan was working. Buying her time to develop her own plan. What exactly was her plan? The evidence suggests it evolved over weeks, shaped by conversations with Joseph that had grown increasingly frank as they both recognized their shared predicament. Joseph had told her finally about the Colonel's promise of freedom and his own certainty that the promise was false. Margaret had shared her fear about what would happen to her once the pregnancy concluded. They were, in the most literal sense, conspirators trapped in the same impossible situation. The plan that emerged was audacious, dangerous, and required perfect timing. Margaret would continue to fake pregnancy, using padding and careful positioning to create the appearance of a growing belly. Meanwhile, Joseph would begin showing illness symptoms that would gradually worsen over the months. When Margaret gave birth, the child would be real, but not hers. There were women on the plantation who were pregnant or who had recently given birth. A newborn could be obtained if the mother could be convinced or coerced. Joseph would die during this same period, and Margaret would claim the child as her own. Once her father believed his plan had succeeded, Margaret and Joseph, who would have faked his death, would flee north using routes they would spend months researching and planning. It was an elaborate deception requiring careful orchestration. But both of them had been living their entire lives under systems of deception and control. They knew how to read the expectations of those in power and how to perform the roles demanded of them while hiding their true thoughts. The difference was that now they would use those skills for their own survival rather than someone else's benefit. The arsenic would play a crucial role in this plan, but not in the way Margaret initially imagined. As October gave way to November, the performance intensified. Margaret's pregnancy progressed according to the timeline her father expected, aided by careful dressmaking that created the illusion of a swelling belly. She had always been skilled with a needle, and the loose house dresses common to the era made the deception easier. She moved more carefully, touched her stomach with the unconscious protectiveness that pregnant women show, and allowed herself to appear more emotional and fragile during her father's visits. The Colonel was transformed by what he believed to be success. He spoke of the future with an animation Margaret had not seen since before her mother's death. He discussed plans for expanding the plantation, investing in new equipment, perhaps purchasing additional land. He brought gifts, baby clothes purchased in Richmond, a cradle that had been his own as an infant, a silver rattle engraved with the Hartley name. Each gift was evidence of how completely he believed the lie, and each made Margaret's stomach turn with a mixture of disgust and fear about what would happen when the truth emerged. Joseph, meanwhile, began his own performance. It started subtly. Complaints of headaches, occasional dizziness, a lack of appetite. The Colonel, focused entirely on Margaret's condition, barely noticed. But by December, Joseph's symptoms had become impossible to ignore. He looked thinner, moved with less of his characteristic strength, and developed a persistent cough that rattled in his chest during cold nights. The Colonel brought the same physician who had examined Margaret. The doctor listened to Joseph's chest, checked his pulse, and prescribed the usual remedies of the era. Rest, whiskey with honey, a tonic of questionable ingredients. He suggested it might be pneumonia, or perhaps consumption, though Joseph showed none of the bloody coughing that marked tuberculosis. The doctor advised keeping Joseph warm and well-fed, noting that valuable property should be maintained. What the doctor did not know, what no one knew except Joseph himself, was that the symptoms were partially real and partially performed. Joseph was making himself sick through a carefully calibrated regimen of his own design, standing in cold rain, sleeping without adequate covering, eating less than his body required, and most significantly consuming small amounts of the same arsenic-laced wallpaper that Margaret had discovered. This was not part of their original plan. Margaret had not asked Joseph to poison himself. But Joseph understood something that Margaret, for all her intelligence, had not fully grasped. A black man could not simply disappear from a plantation and have that disappearance attributed to natural causes or accident. If Joseph vanished, the Colonel would hunt him with the full resources available to a wealthy planter. Dogs, slave catchers, legal bounties, newspaper advertisements. But if Joseph died convincingly and publicly, then he would be erased from the equation. He could be buried, mourned, and forgotten. While someone with his name and general description made their way north using forged papers. For this substitution to work, there would need to be a body, and that body would need to show signs consistent with the illness Joseph was claiming to have. Hence the arsenic consumed in doses large enough to cause visible symptoms but not so large as to cause immediate suspicious death. It was a calculation of horrifying precision. Joseph was deliberately destroying his health, gambling that he could survive long enough to stage his death and escape while doing enough actual damage to himself that any post-death examination would find exactly what it expected to find. A sick man who had succumbed to fever or consumption or whatever vague diagnosis rural medicine assigned to wasting illnesses. Margaret discovered what Joseph was doing in early December when she noticed the same greenish powder under his fingernails that she sometimes found under her own. The confrontation happened late one evening after the Colonel had made his weekly visit and departed. "You're poisoning yourself," Margaret said, her voice flat. Joseph looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I'm ensuring we both survive." By appearing to die, he paused. "If I simply disappear, your father will never stop looking. If I die, I become irrelevant to his concerns. He'll focus entirely on the child, on his plans for the future. He won't waste resources chasing a ghost. But you'll actually be sick. You might actually die." "I might," Joseph agreed. "But if I don't do this, I will definitely die or be condemned to remain property forever. This gives me a chance." Margaret understood the logic, but she also understood the cost. Joseph was sacrificing his health, possibly his life, for a slim possibility of freedom. It was the mathematics of desperation, the calculations that enslaved people made every day when weighing the certainty of suffering against the risk of something better. "We need a body," Margaret said finally. "If you're going to fake death, we need something to bury." This was the moment when their plan shifted from desperate to macabre. They spent the following days discussing possibilities, each more difficult than the last. They could not simply bury an empty coffin. The Colonel would likely want to see Joseph's body, and plantation protocol often required the overseer or owner to confirm a slave's death before permitting burial. They needed an actual corpse, one that could plausibly pass for Joseph if examination was cursory. The solution, when it came, was both practical and horrifying. There were 2 enslaved men on the plantation of similar age and build to Joseph. One was named Samuel, the other Isaiah. Both worked in the tobacco fields and lived in the quarters far from the main house. And in the winter months, deaths among enslaved workers were not uncommon. Pneumonia, influenza, and accidents claimed lives with grim regularity. Joseph and Margaret were not planning murder. They were waiting for death and preparing to exploit it. January 1848 arrived with ice storms that coated the Virginia Piedmont in crystalline layers, turning every tree branch into glass and making the unpaved roads nearly impassable. The Colonel's visits became less frequent, sometimes stretching to 10 days between appearances when the roads were particularly treacherous. This isolation actually helped Margaret and Joseph's performance. The Colonel could not observe them closely enough to notice inconsistencies. Margaret was now supposedly 5 months pregnant, her padded dresses creating a convincing silhouette under the loose winter coat she wore. She had developed the pregnancy performance to an art form, the hand on the lower back, the slight waddle in her walk, the sudden stops as if feeling movement inside her. She had read extensively in the medical texts her father had provided about pregnancy's progression, memorizing the symptoms and changes women reported. When the Colonel asked questions, she provided answers that matched exactly what his books told him to expect. Joseph's decline was more genuine and more visible. By late January, he had lost significant weight, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been intimidating in its power. The cough was constant now, sometimes bringing up small amounts of blood, a symptom that terrified Margaret, but which Joseph insisted was necessary for the performance. His skin had taken on a greyish cast, and his eyes had sunk into their sockets. When the Colonel visited and saw Joseph's condition, he showed concern only in the economic sense. Worry about the loss of valuable property, irritation about the timing. The Colonel brought the physician again in late January. The doctor examined Joseph more thoroughly, this time, noting the weight loss, the labored breathing, the weakness in his limbs. He diagnosed advanced consumption, saying that Joseph likely had weeks, perhaps a month or two, remaining. He suggested moving Joseph to the plantation sick house, but the Colonel refused. That would require explaining why his most valuable slave had been isolated in the overseer's cabin for months. Instead, the Colonel instructed Margaret to care for Joseph as best she could, to keep him warm and fed, and to send word immediately if his condition worsened significantly. This created a strange intimacy in the cabin. Margaret, who had been raised to believe that enslaved people should remain as invisible as possible except when performing their duties, now found herself nursing Joseph through the illness he had deliberately induced. She prepared broths and teas, changed sweat-soaked bedding, sat with him during fevered nights when his breathing became labored. These were tasks that plantation mistresses sometimes performed for house slaves they considered particularly valuable, but always with a distance that maintained the hierarchy. Margaret could not maintain that distance. Not anymore. They had conspired together, planned together, and now his suffering was partially her responsibility. During Joseph's more lucid moments, they discussed the final elements of their plan. Margaret had made contact through carefully coded conversations during her father's visits with several of the women in the plantation quarters. One of them, a woman named Ruth, had given birth in December to a light-skinned infant whose father was rumored to be the previous overseer. Ruth was terrified about what might happen to this child who was neither fully black nor fully white in a world that had strict categories for both. Margaret had implied without stating directly that she might be able to offer the child a better future. Ruth understood the implication. The child would be raised as white given opportunities that would never be available to a mixed-race child on a plantation. Ruth agreed, though the price of that agreement would haunt her for the remainder of her life. She would hand over her infant and live with the knowledge that her child would grow up, never knowing their real mother, living in a world that would destroy them if their heritage was ever discovered. But she made the calculation that many enslaved mothers made in those terrible years. Survival, even with pain, was better than the alternatives. The other element they needed was a body. And here fate intervened with cruel timing. On February 8, 1848, a man named Isaiah collapsed in the tobacco barn while working. He had contracted influenza, which had developed into pneumonia. By February 10, he was dead. He was 31 years old, approximately Joseph's height and build. And in the final stages of illness, he had looked gaunt and wasted, much as Joseph looked now. Joseph learned of Isaiah's death from one of the enslaved men who brought weekly provisions to the cabin. Within 2 hours, he and Margaret had worked out the final details of the exchange. It would happen at night, 3 days later, when the next provisions delivery was scheduled. Joseph would stage his final collapse. Margaret would send an urgent message to her father via the provision delivery. While waiting for the colonel to arrive, they would execute the substitution. The plan required several people's cooperation: the man who delivered provisions, a woman from the quarters who would help prepare Isaiah's body, and Ruth who would bring her infant to the cabin under cover of darkness. Each person had their own reasons for participating. Some hoped for future favor. Some feared punishment if they refused. And some genuinely believed they were helping two desperate people escape impossible circumstances. On the night of February 13, 1848, the temperature dropped below freezing. A clear sky and full moon made the Virginia landscape look like it had been carved from marble. Margaret waited in the cabin, wearing her padded dress, her hands shaking as she prepared the scene. Joseph lay on the bed in the back room, weak but conscious, his breathing deliberately labored. At 9 o'clock, they heard the sound of a cart approaching. The provision delivery man, a man named Silas, appeared with a cart that contained not just food supplies, but a pine coffin containing Isaiah's body. Behind him, moving through the shadows, came Ruth carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, her infant son, 3 months old, sleeping against her chest. The substitution happened quickly, efficiently, choreographed by necessity. Isaiah's body was moved into the cabin and arranged in Joseph's bed, positioned and dressed in Joseph's clothes. Joseph himself, wrapped in a dark coat and hat, slipped out through the back door and climbed into a hidden compartment Silas had constructed in the provision cart. Ruth handed her child to Margaret, who took the baby with hands that trembled so badly she nearly dropped him. The infant woke and began to cry, and Margaret instinctively held him close, shushing him, feeling the tiny heart beating against her chest. Margaret looked at Ruth in the moonlight. The woman's face was streaked with tears, her eyes holding an expression of grief so profound it seemed to contain all the sorrows of her people across all the generations of bondage. "I'll keep him safe," Margaret whispered. "I promise." Ruth nodded once, then disappeared into the darkness without speaking, because to speak would have meant breaking entirely. Silas drove the cart away with Joseph hidden beneath sacks of grain and supplies. The plan was for him to be delivered to a contact in Richmond, a free black man who worked at the docks and had connections to the Underground Railroad network. From there, Joseph would begin the dangerous journey north, using papers that identified him as a freedman named Daniel Collins, a skilled carpenter traveling to Pennsylvania to find work. Margaret returned to the cabin holding the baby, and looked at Isaiah's body arranged in Joseph's bed. In the morning, she would discover him dead. The colonel would come, would see exactly what he expected to see. A slave who had succumbed to consumption after months of illness. He would arrange for burial, would likely be annoyed at the loss of property, but not suspicious. The death would be recorded in the plantation register, and Joseph would cease to exist in the official records of Virginia. But Margaret had made a fatal error in judgment, an underestimation born of her limited experience with her father's true nature. She had assumed the colonel would accept Joseph's death as an unfortunate but explainable outcome of illness. She had not considered that her father, having invested so much emotional energy in his eugenic scheme, might demand a more thorough examination of the circumstances, and she had not considered what would happen when the colonel began to doubt her pregnancy. Margaret sent word of Joseph's death at first light on February 14, using the prearranged system, where she would hang a black cloth from the cabin's front window if urgent assistance was needed. Within 3 hours, Colonel Hartley arrived, bringing with him the county physician and an expression of barely controlled fury that Margaret had never seen before. The colonel examined Isaiah's body in the bed with a thoroughness that made Margaret's blood freeze. He checked the hands, the face, the build. He questioned Margaret extensively about Joseph's final hours, about the progression of his illness, about whether Joseph had said anything unusual before dying. The physician performed his examination and confirmed death by consumption, but the colonel seemed dissatisfied with this conclusion. "Where did you bury the placenta?" the colonel asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on Margaret's padded belly. Margaret's mind went blank. In all her preparation, in all the medical texts she had read about pregnancy, she had not anticipated this question. "I don't understand, Father. When women miscarry in the 5th month, there is tissue that must be disposed of." The Colonel said, his voice cold. "It's too early for a fully formed child, but there is significant material." "Where is it?" "I haven't miscarried," Margaret said, her voice rising with panic. "The baby is fine." The Colonel's hand shot out and grabbed her belly, squeezing hard enough to feel the padding beneath the fabric. His face transformed from suspicion to absolute rage. He tore open her dress, revealing the elaborate construction of cloth and padding she had created to simulate pregnancy. "You lying," he breathed. "There is no child." What happened next occurred with the speed of violence. The Colonel struck Margaret across the face hard enough to knock her to the floor. He kicked over furniture, screaming questions she couldn't answer through her split lip and loosened teeth. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to where Isaiah's body lay, demanding to know where Joseph was, what she had done, who had helped her. Margaret, through her terror and pain, maintained one final deception. She told her father that Joseph was dead, that this was his body, that she had lied about the pregnancy because she could not bear the shame of what he had forced her to do. She insisted she had been alone in this deception, that no one else knew, that Joseph had died, ignorant of her plan. The physician, deeply uncomfortable with the domestic violence unfolding before him, attempted to intercede. The Colonel ordered him to examine the body more thoroughly to confirm it was actually Joseph. The physician, lacking any sophisticated means of identification, could only note that the body matched the general description: height, approximate age, advanced illness. The Colonel was not satisfied, but without clear evidence to the contrary, he could not prove the body was anyone other than who Margaret claimed it to be. The Colonel made his decision with cold calculation. Joseph would be buried immediately with minimal ceremony and in an unmarked grave. Margaret would be confined to her room in the main house. No one would be told about the false pregnancy. The entire experiment would be erased from the family history as if it had never happened. But the Colonel's mind was deteriorating under the weight of failure and rage. He had invested 6 months, significant resources, and his last desperate hope in this scheme. Its failure meant not just personal disappointment, but the end of the Hartley family line, the final confirmation that his legacy would die with him. That night, alone in his study, he began drinking heavily and reviewing the medical texts about pregnancy and genetics that had inspired his plan. He became convinced that Margaret had poisoned Joseph, that she had murdered his property and destroyed his last chance at continuing his bloodline. Over the following days, the Colonel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He interrogated the plantation's enslaved population, searching for conspirators. He examined the cabin repeatedly, looking for evidence. He checked the county death records, looking for other deaths that might have provided a substitute body. And slowly he began to piece together elements of the truth. The timing of Isaiah's death, the provision delivery schedule, the fact that certain trusted slaves had been near the cabin on the night of February 13th. But the complete truth eluded him, and this uncertainty drove him to increasingly paranoid behavior. He accused Margaret of witchcraft, of using occult practices to curse his family. He contemplated having her committed to the state lunatic asylum in Williamsburg. He drafted letters to relatives discussing the possibility of Margaret living out her days under their supervision, a permanent spinster dependent, living in quiet shame. Margaret, confined to her room under lock and key, spent these days in a fugue state between fear and exhaustion. The Colonel allowed her no visitors, no correspondence, minimal food. He told the household staff she was suffering from grief-induced hysteria and needed isolation to recover. The servants, who had known Margaret since childhood, brought her what comforts they could sneak past the Colonel's attention, but they could not free her. On March 3, 1848, Colonel Edmund Hartley was found dead in his study, collapsed over his desk with foam around his mouth, and his body convulsed into a position that suggested seizure. The physician who had examined both Margaret and Joseph was called, and he diagnosed apoplexy, a stroke common enough in men of the Colonel's age, who had experienced significant stress and consumed excessive alcohol. But the physician noted something curious in his private records, records that would not be discovered until decades later. The Colonel's symptoms were more consistent with strychnine poisoning than natural stroke. However, there was no evidence of poison, no clear source, and the social consequences of suggesting a respected veteran and planter had been murdered by his own daughter were too severe to contemplate without absolute proof. The physician ruled death by natural causes and said nothing more. Margaret was freed from her locked room by the household staff after the Colonel's body was found. She claimed to know nothing about his death, stating only that she had been confined and isolated for days. The Colonel's will, written years earlier, left everything to Margaret as his sole heir. She was now the owner of 400 acres, the house, and 17 enslaved people, including Ruth and her infant son. The settlement of Colonel Hartley's estate took 6 months, complicated by debts he had hidden from everyone, including his daughter. Margaret discovered that the plantation was mortgaged nearly to its full value, that creditors held claims against almost every asset, and that her father's paranoid final weeks had included withdrawing substantial amounts of cash that were never found. She was forced to sell acreage, some of the enslaved workers, and most of the house's furnishings to satisfy debts and maintain a minimal operation. The process of selling human beings, people she had lived among, people who had risked everything to help her, destroyed whatever remained of Margaret's moral certainty. She told herself she was choosing carefully, selling only to local buyers whom she believed would be less cruel, keeping families together when possible. But these were the rationalizations of someone complicit in an evil system, and she knew it. Each sale felt like a betrayal of the promises she had made to herself in that cabin when she had imagined herself as different from her father. Ruth she could not sell. Ruth, whose eyes followed little Edmund with an expression that broke Margaret's heart every time she witnessed it. Ruth, who had given up everything and received nothing in return except the distant sight of her son being raised by another woman. Margaret assigned Ruth to work in the main house, ostensibly as a nursemaid to Edmund, which allowed the child's real mother to be near him, even if she could never claim him. The arrangement was torture for both women, though neither ever spoke of it directly. Ruth would hold Edmund when he cried, would sing him songs from her own childhood, would teach him small things, how to skip stones in the creek, how to identify birds by their calls, how to find the sweetest blackberries in the thicket behind the tobacco barn. Margaret watched these moments with a complex mixture of gratitude, guilt, and possessiveness that she could never fully untangle. Through all of this, Margaret kept Ruth's infant, the child she had promised to protect. She told the county clerk that during her grief-induced hysteria following her father's death, she had adopted the orphan child of a deceased cousin from North Carolina. The story was thin, but Margaret was a white woman of property, and white women of property were afforded certain assumptions of truthfulness that would never extend to enslaved people or the poor. She named the child Edmund after her father, in a gesture that was either deeply ironic or profoundly disturbed. Perhaps she believed that by giving her father's name to a child he would have despised, a child whose very existence represented the failure of his eugenic fantasies, she was achieving some twisted form of victory over his memory. Or perhaps the name was an anchor, a way of maintaining the fiction that this child was truly a Hartley, legitimately part of the family lineage. The boy grew up in the plantation house, raised as white, educated by tutors Margaret hired despite her limited finances. She spent money she could not afford on his education, bringing in teachers from Richmond to instruct him in Latin, mathematics, literature, and history. She was determined that Edmund would have every advantage, every opportunity that her father had wanted for a male heir. The irony that this heir carried none of the Colonel's blood, and carried the blood of people the Colonel had enslaved was not lost on Margaret. She dwelled on that irony during sleepless nights, wondering if the universe possessed some sense of poetic justice. After all, the community accepted Edmund as a Hartley, though some whispered about his slightly darker complexion and Margaret's suspicious spinster status. Neighbors speculated about Margaret's romantic past. Surely, she must have had some relationship that produced this child, despite her claims of adoption. The more charitable assumed she was protecting the reputation of a deceased cousin. The less charitable whispered darker possibilities involving Margaret herself and unknown fathers. But whispers without proof went nowhere in a society that valued respectability above truth. And Margaret's status as a plantation owner, however diminished her circumstances, still commanded a certain deference. As Edmund grew, Margaret watched him with an intensity that sometimes frightened even her. She searched his features for signs of Joseph, the shape of his hands, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved. But Edmund had inherited Ruth's fine bone structure and quick intelligence, combined with physical traits from Ruth's unknown grandfather or great-grandfather that had produced his lighter coloring. He looked like no one and everyone. A child who could pass through the world as white because the world desperately wanted to maintain its categories and would accept the performance if it was executed well enough. Margaret never married. The community found this unsurprising. She was damaged goods now, a woman past prime marriageable age with an adopted child of questionable origin and a plantation that was more debt than asset. The few men who might have considered proposing were deterred by Margaret herself, who had developed a reputation for cold competence and a sharp tongue that discouraged romantic approaches. She threw herself into managing the plantation with an efficiency that surprised those who remembered her as a sheltered, overweight spinster. She learned agriculture from necessity, studying the same way she had once studied novels, with complete focus and remarkable retention. She experimented with crop rotation, invested what little capital she had in better equipment, and proved surprisingly skilled at managing the people she still enslaved. This skill came not from cruelty, but from a kind of exhausted pragmatism. She knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped in a system that offered no good choices, only gradations of bad ones. She treated the enslaved workers on her property with more consideration than most planters. Better food, fewer punishments, some small allowances for family life. It was not kindness exactly, but it was something less cruel than the norm. Still, she owned people. She bought and sold human beings when economic necessity demanded it. She enforced discipline when work was not done. She participated fully in the machinery of slavery, even as she understood, perhaps better than most white Virginians, exactly how evil that machinery was. The contradiction hollowed her out from the inside, leaving her functional but fundamentally broken. She lived on the plantation, managing its declining fortunes with competence, if not passion, until 1863, when the Civil War reached Virginia in force. By then, Edmund was 15 years old, tall and serious, with dreams of attending the University of Virginia once the war ended. Ruth was 41, still working in the main house, her hair going grey, her body worn by decades of labor. And Margaret was 48, looking older, her hair completely white, her body finely thin in the way her father had always wanted, though this thinness came from stress and poor nutrition rather than any conscious effort. As Union and Confederate armies swept across the state, Margaret made the decision that would define her final years. She freed all the enslaved people remaining on the plantation, including Ruth, who had stayed close to her son, even as he was raised as someone else's child. This was not purely altruistic. The Emancipation Proclamation had already declared enslaved people in Confederate territories to be free, and Union forces were approaching the area. Margaret was acknowledging reality more than making a moral stand, but she did it formally with papers that she helped each person understand, explaining that they were now free to leave or to stay and work for wages if they chose. Most left within days, heading toward Union lines or toward family members on other plantations from whom they had been separated by sale. Ruth was among those who left, though the departure was agonizing in ways Margaret had not fully anticipated. Ruth came to Margaret the night before she planned to leave, standing in the doorway of Margaret's study with an expression that was unreadable. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Ruth said simply, "Take care of my son." "I have always," Margaret began, but Ruth cut her off. "Take care of my son," Ruth repeated, her voice harder. "Tell him the truth when he's old enough to bear it. Tell him his mama loved him enough to give him away. Tell him." She stopped, unable to continue. Margaret stood, moved toward her, then stopped, unsure if touch would be welcome. "I will tell him," Margaret said finally. "I promise you when the time is right, I will tell him everything." Ruth nodded once, then turned and walked away. She left Virginia in 1863, joining the contraband camps that followed Union armies. She never publicly revealed that Edmund was her son. She carried that secret until her death in 1879 in Philadelphia, where she had settled and married and raised 3 other children who grew up free. Those children knew they had an older half-brother somewhere, but Ruth never told them his name or where he could be found. She said only that he was living as White and that revealing his identity would destroy him. Her younger children respected her wishes and never searched for their half-brother. Edmund Hartley lived until 1891, dying at age 43 of heart failure. He never knew his true parentage. Margaret kept her promise to Ruth in the most cowardly way possible. She wrote a letter explaining everything and left instructions that it should be given to Edmund after her death. But when Margaret died in 1867, the executor of her minimal estate was a distant cousin who read the letter, was horrified by its contents, and burned it immediately to protect the family reputation. Edmund died believing he was the adopted orphan of Margaret's deceased cousin. Never knowing that his real mother had given him up so he could live free, never knowing about Joseph's sacrifice or the desperate conspiracy that had brought him into the world. He married, had 2 children, and worked as an accountant in Richmond, living a respectable middle-class life in the post-war South. His children and grandchildren carried the Hartley name into the 20th century, never knowing the truth of their origin. One of Edmund's granddaughters became a school teacher in the 1920s, quietly passing as White in a segregated society, unknowingly carrying on the deception that had begun with her great-grandmother's desperate plan. Another descendant moved to California in the 1930s and became a minor Hollywood set designer. The family history completely forgotten. The Virginia plantation, just a vague story about ancestors who had owned land once. Margaret died in 1867 of pneumonia in the same room where her father had died 19 years earlier. She was 52 years old and looked 70, worn down by years of managing an impossible situation and living with impossible guilt. She left behind remarkably few personal effects, no diaries, no extensive correspondence, no memoir. Whether this was because she had never kept such records or because she had systematically destroyed them before her death remains unknown. The plantation was sold to pay her remaining debts and the house eventually fell into ruin, claimed by time and weather until it was demolished in 1904. In her final weeks, as pneumonia gradually filled her lungs and made breathing an agony, Margaret was attended by an elderly freed woman named Sarah, who had once worked in the Hartley kitchen. Sarah later told her own grandchildren that Margaret's final words, whispered so quietly Sarah had to lean close to hear them, were, "Tell Joseph I kept my promise." Sarah had no idea who Joseph was or what promise Margaret meant. And by the time historians began investigating the Hartley story, Sarah had been dead for 40 years, and her grandchildren had only the vaguest memory of the story. The truth about what happened in the overseer's cabin in 1847 and 1848 might have remained buried forever, except for a discovery made in 1912 during renovation of an old Richmond warehouse. Workers found a tin box hidden behind a false wall, containing approximately 50 letters written between 1848 and 1849, along with a handful of other documents, including a manumission paper that appeared to have been deliberately torn in half and a birth certificate for a child named Edmund Hartley with a notation in the margin that no one could explain. The tin box was donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1913, where it generated brief academic interest before being largely forgotten amid the larger historiography of slavery and the Civil War. The letters were published in a limited scholarly edition in 1924, edited by a professor who noted their significance as documentation of both the Underground Railroad and the complex interpersonal dynamics of slavery, but who failed to connect them to the Hartley family or to investigate the broader story. The professor, a man named Dr. Harold Stevenson from the College of William and Mary, approached the letters primarily as linguistic artifacts. He was interested in the writing styles, the coded language used to discuss escape plans, and the documentary evidence of Underground Railroad networks operating in Virginia. He published his edition with extensive footnotes about vocabulary and syntax, but he made almost no effort to identify DC or to trace the letters back to their source. In his introduction, he speculated that the correspondents were probably deceased by the time of publication, and that their identities were likely lost to history. This scholarly incuriosity or perhaps deliberate avoidance meant that the Hartley connection remained hidden for another 23 years. The letters themselves sat in the Historical Society's archives, occasionally consulted by researchers working on Underground Railroad history or antebellum Virginia society, but never generating sustained attention. They were catalogued simply as anonymous correspondence 1848 to 1849 related to fugitive slaves, which gave no hint of the deeper story they contained. The archive boxes sat on shelves gathering dust while the full truth of what they documented waited for someone with the right combination of curiosity, persistence, and access to cross-reference them with other sources. It was not until 1947 when a graduate student researching county death records noticed the unusual circumstances around Colonel Hartley's death and began cross-referencing with other sources that the complete narrative began to emerge. The student, a woman named Elizabeth Winters, was working on a dissertation about sudden deaths among Virginia planters in the 1840s, specifically investigating whether there was a pattern of violence or poisoning that had been obscured by sympathetic physicians who were reluctant to accuse white families of murder. Winters had stumbled onto the Hartley case almost by accident. She had been examining death certificates from Frederick County when she noticed Colonel Edmund Hartley's death certificate signed by a Dr. Nathaniel Vaughan contained an unusual notation in the margin, a small symbol that looked like an asterisk with a circle around it. Winters found the same symbol on 3 other death certificates signed by Dr. Vaughan between 1846 and 1851. All for wealthy white men who had died suddenly of apparent strokes or heart failure. When she investigated further, she discovered that Dr. Vaughan had kept a private journal, never published, which used that symbol to mark cases where he suspected foul play, but could not prove it or chose not to pursue it due to social considerations. Dr. Vaughan's journal, which Winters found in the possession of his great-grandson in Norfolk, contained a brief entry about Colonel Hartley's death. Presented with all the classic signs of strychnine, the rigidity, the convulsions, the foam, but no clear source, no witnesses, and the man's daughter locked in her room. What am I to do? Accuse a bereaved daughter with no evidence? Destroy her reputation and invite lawsuit? I mark this case with my private symbol and leave it to God's judgment. If she did poison him, she had provocations I cannot imagine bearing myself. This discovery electrified Winters. She began investigating the Hartley family systematically, tracking down property records, sale documents, plantation ledgers, and county court files. She discovered the unusual circumstances of Edmund's adoption. The 6-month period when Margaret and Joseph had been isolated in the overseer's cabin and Joseph's death from consumption just weeks before Colonel Hartley's own death. She found testimony in county records from enslaved people who had been sold from the Hartley plantation in 1848, several of whom mentioned in their freedom papers issued after the Civil War that they had witnessed strange goings-on at the plantation in early 1848. The student, Elizabeth Winters, spent 3 years tracking down records, interviewing elderly descendants of people who had been enslaved on the Hartley plantation, and analyzing the letters in light of the historical evidence. She traveled across Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, seeking anyone who might have information about the Hartley family, or about a freedman named Daniel Collins, who had worked as a carpenter in Pittsburgh between 1848 and the 1870s. In Pittsburgh, she found records of a Daniel Collins who had purchased property in 1852 in the Hill District, a neighborhood where free black people had established a thriving community. Collins had married in 1854 to a woman named Abigail Freeman, herself a former fugitive from Maryland. They had 3 children between 1855 and 1861. Collins had been active in the local African Methodist Episcopal Church and had served on the board of a school for black children. He had worked steadily as a carpenter and had built a modest but comfortable life. The last record Winters could find was a property tax payment in 1873, after which Daniel Collins disappeared from the Pittsburgh records entirely. Whether he had died, moved elsewhere, or simply dropped from the documentary record for other reasons, remained a mystery that Winters could not solve. Winters attempted to trace Collins's children, but found the trail went cold after 1880. The census of that year listed Abigail Collins as a widow, living with her adult daughter and grandchildren. But subsequent records proved impossible to locate with certainty. If Joseph had survived and lived as Daniel Collins until the 1870s, his descendants had either scattered beyond her ability to trace them, or had died without leaving clear records. The possibility that Joseph, if he truly was Daniel Collins, had lived 25 years in freedom, had married and raised children, had built something resembling a normal life after the horrors of the Hartley plantation, offered a faint glimmer of redemption in an otherwise dark story. But it remained only a possibility, never a certainty. The interviews Winters conducted with elderly African Americans who had family connections to the Hartley plantation were both illuminating and heartbreaking. She spoke with a woman named Clara Jefferson, age 84, in 1949, whose grandmother had been enslaved on the Hartley property. Clara remembered her grandmother telling stories about the colonel's daughter who went mad and about the strong man who got sick and died, though some said he didn't die at all. Clara's grandmother had maintained that Ruth, Edmund's real mother, had been treated with unusual respect by Margaret after the colonel's death, though she was still enslaved. Grandmother said Miss Margaret never hit Ruth, never even raised her voice to her, which was strange because Miss Margaret could be sharp with the others, and Ruth got to spend time with the white child more than made sense for a field hand's daughter being near the master's adopted boy. Another interview with a 92-year-old man named Thomas Crawford in Philadelphia provided more details about Ruth's later life. Thomas had known Ruth in the 1870s when she attended the same church his family attended. He remembered her as a sad woman who never talked much about her past except to say she'd left a piece of her heart in Virginia. Ruth had told Thomas's mother in confidence that she had once given up a child so the child could live free and that it was the right thing and the worst thing she had ever done. Thomas's mother had passed this story to him decades later. And he in turn shared it with Winters, not knowing it was the key piece that would help her understand Edmund's true origin. Winters also discovered through painstaking examination of Reconstruction-era pension records that a woman matching Ruth's description had applied for a widow's pension in 1881 claiming her husband had served in a United States Colored Troops regiment during the Civil War. The application listed her as Ruth Williams, formerly of Virginia, and mentioned that she had 4 children, 3 living and 1 raised elsewhere under circumstances of necessity during slavery times. The application was denied due to insufficient documentation of the marriage, but its existence confirmed that Ruth had indeed survived the war, had married, and had acknowledged, at least in an official document that she believed would remain confidential, that she had a child who had been separated from her during slavery. Winters's dissertation, completed in 1950, presented the full story as best as she could reconstruct it from fragmentary evidence. She argued that Margaret and Joseph had conspired to escape their impossible situation through an elaborate deception involving a fake pregnancy and death, and that this plan had partially succeeded and partially catastrophically failed. She further argued that Margaret had almost certainly poisoned her father, though she acknowledged this could never be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The dissertation ran to 473 pages, meticulously documented with footnotes and appendices that included transcriptions of the letters from the tin box, excerpts from Dr. Vaughan's journal, property records, death certificates, and dozens of other primary sources. Winters had cross-referenced every claim, tracked down every lead, and built what she believed was an irrefutable case for her interpretation of events. Her committee at the University of Virginia praised the work as groundbreaking scholarship and a model of historical detective work. But the dissertation's reception in the broader historical community was decidedly mixed and revealed deep anxieties about how American history should be told, particularly stories that complicated comfortable narratives about the antebellum South. Some historians argued that Winters had overinterpreted the evidence, seeing conspiracy where there was only tragic coincidence. A professor from Duke University writing in a review for the American Historical Review in 1951 claimed that Winters had allowed her imagination to run wild and had constructed an elaborate fiction from sources that admitted alternative interpretations. He argued that Colonel Hartley's death was almost certainly natural, a stroke brought on by stress and alcohol consumption, and that attributing it to poisoning by Margaret was inflammatory speculation without basis. In fact, he suggested that the letters in the tin box might not even be from Margaret and Joseph, but from entirely different individuals whose stories had no connection to the Hartley plantation. This review was particularly damaging because it set the tone for how many male historians would approach Winters's work throughout the 1950s. She was accused of being overly sympathetic to her subjects, of allowing her emotions to color her interpretation, of lacking the objectivity that serious scholarship required. These criticisms, common for women academics in that era, effectively marginalized her dissertation, even though her research was demonstrably more thorough than that of many of her critics. Others suggested she had been too sympathetic to Margaret, excusing murder as self-defense against patriarchal control. A review in the Journal of Southern History in 1952, written by a female professor from Louisiana, took Winters to task for romanticizing a woman who remained a slaveholder until forced by war to free her slaves, and for downplaying Margaret's complicity in a system of racial oppression. This review argued that Margaret deserved condemnation, not understanding, and that Winters's nuanced portrayal of her as both victim and victimizer was morally confused and historically irresponsible. Still others focused on Joseph's fate, debating whether he had truly escaped or whether he had died during the attempt. A prominent scholar of the Underground Railroad argued in a 1953 article that the Daniel Collins in Pittsburgh could not possibly have been Joseph because the dates did not align correctly and because a man who had deliberately poisoned himself with arsenic could not have recovered sufficiently to undertake the arduous journey north and then live productively for decades. This scholar suggested that Joseph had likely died shortly after leaving the Hartley plantation, perhaps in Richmond or somewhere along the route north, and that the person living as Daniel Collins in Pittsburgh was simply another freedman with no connection to the Hartley story. Winters defended her work vigorously, publishing responses to her critics in various academic journals throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s. She pointed out that arsenic poisoning, while dangerous, was not always fatal, especially if the doses were small and spread over time, and that the human body could recover from significant arsenic exposure given proper care and nutrition. She noted that the timeline between Joseph's departure in February 1848 and Daniel Collins's appearance in Pittsburgh property records in 1852 allowed ample time for recovery, travel, and establishment of a new identity. She argued that the specificity of the details in the letters, references to the cabin, to Ruth, to Edmund, to events that matched perfectly with documentary evidence from the plantation, made it virtually impossible that they were from anyone other than Margaret and Joseph. But the damage was done. Publishers rejected her manuscript repeatedly throughout the 1950s, citing insufficient commercial appeal or concerns about libel despite all the principals being long dead. University presses worried about the controversial nature of a white woman accusing another white woman of murder and about the implications of presenting enslaved people as active agents in complex conspiracies rather than passive victims. The story challenged too many comfortable narratives about the antebellum South. It suggested that plantation daughters could be simultaneously victims and villains, that enslaved people could outwit their masters through elaborate deception, that family lines thought to be purely white might carry hidden black ancestry, and that the neat categories of race and class that Southern society depended upon were far more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. Winters eventually published a heavily edited version of her work as an article in a small academic journal in 1956, but it reached only a tiny audience of specialists. She never secured a tenure-track position despite her evident talent and thoroughness as a researcher. She taught at various women's colleges in the South throughout the 1950s and 1960s, always on temporary contracts, always one step away from unemployment. She died in 1969 at age 56 of cancer. Her dissertation still unpublished in its full form. Her magnum opus gathering dust in a filing cabinet in her small apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina. Her obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of her groundbreaking research on the Hartley plantation, noting only that she had been a dedicated educator and respected member of the community. But what was not debatable, regardless of academic controversies, was the fundamental horror of the story Winters had uncovered. A father who treated his daughter and an enslaved man as breeding stock, forcing them into an arrangement neither could refuse. A woman who responded to victimization by becoming calculating and potentially lethal. A man who poisoned himself rather than accept continued enslavement. A mother who gave up her child hoping he might have a better life as someone else's son. And a child who grew up never knowing his true history. Living as white in a society that would have destroyed him if it knew his actual heritage. The legacy of slavery extended far beyond the immediate brutality of bondage. It created situations where ordinary people, people who might have lived unremarkable lives in different circumstances, were forced into impossible choices that broke them morally, psychologically, and physically. Margaret Hartley was a victim who became a victimizer. Joseph was a survivor who sacrificed his health and identity for a chance at freedom. Ruth was a mother who chose her child's survival over her own connection to him. The Colonel was a desperate man who destroyed everything he claimed to love in his obsession with legacy and racial purity. None of them escaped undamaged. None of their choices were without terrible cost. Margaret lived the remainder of her life imprisoned by guilt and the weight of secrets she could never reveal. Joseph, if he survived at all, lived under an assumed identity, forever separated from everyone who had known him as himself. Ruth spent decades knowing her son was alive, but never able to claim him. Edmund lived and died, never knowing the truth about who he was, or the sacrifices made so he could exist as a free man in a society built on the bondage of people who looked like his mother. The Hartley plantation is gone now, reclaimed by forest and time. The overseer's cabin, where this story unfolded, collapsed in the 1890s, leaving only a depression in the ground and some scattered stones from the chimney. The main house was demolished in 1904, and the land was sold off in parcels to various buyers who had no knowledge of what had occurred there. Nothing visible remains to mark what happened, except a historical marker erected in 1936 along the highway that notes only the plantation's dates of operation and its role in tobacco agriculture. The marker makes no mention of Margaret, Joseph, Ruth, or Edmund. Their story remained hidden, known only to a handful of scholars who read Wintersy's obscure 1956 article, or who happened to examine the anonymous letters in the Virginia Historical Society archives. The truth persisted only in fragments. In those letters hidden in a tin box, in county death records with suspicious notations in the margins, in the oral histories passed down through families who had been enslaved on the property, and in Elizabeth Wintersy's unpublished dissertation gathering dust in an archive. It persisted because it revealed uncomfortable truths about American history. The ways that slavery distorted every human relationship it touched. How desperation drives people to extremes they would never have imagined themselves capable of. And how the victims of one system often become perpetrators within another. What do you think happened in that cabin during those 6 months of isolation? Was Margaret a victim who found the only way to survive her father's monstrous plan? Or was she a calculating woman who used Joseph's desperation for her own ends? Did Joseph truly escape and live those 25 years in Pittsburgh as Daniel Collins, raising children and building a life in freedom? Or did he die somewhere along the route north, another casualty of a system that treated human beings as property to be used and discarded? And what about Edmund? What would his life have been if he had known the truth about his parentage? About his mother's sacrifice, about the conspiracy that brought him into existence? These questions have no simple answers because the lives they concerned were not simple. They were lives shaped by systems of power and oppression that offered no good choices, only choices with different costs and different forms of suffering. To judge Margaret as simply evil ignores her own victimization under both slavery and patriarchy. To romanticize her as a heroic victim ignores her complicity in a system that enslaved human beings. To see Joseph as only a victim ignores his intelligence and agency in planning his escape. To see him as only a hero ignores the terrible price he paid in his own body. To understand Ruth's choice requires acknowledging both her profound love for her child and the horrific system that made such a heartbreaking choice seem like the best option available. The story of the Hartley plantation challenges our comfortable narratives about heroes and villains, about clear moral choices and obvious right answers. It shows us people trapped in an evil system, making terrible choices because all their options were terrible, surviving through deception and sacrifice and compromise and occasionally through violence. It shows us that history is not a story of good people and bad people, but of complex human beings shaped by forces larger than themselves trying to survive and occasionally trying to do something better than mere survival, even when the cost is almost unbearable. If you found this story as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Margaret poisoned her father? Do you think Joseph truly escaped and lived as Daniel Collins? What would you have done in Ruth's position? Would you have given up your child for a chance at a better life? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones if we want to understand American history honestly rather than through comfortable myths. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden and horrifying corners of American history. Stories that challenge us, disturb us, and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. Share this with someone who appreciates stories that don't offer easy answers, but instead reveal the moral complexity of human experience under systems of oppression. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these explorations of the dark chapters that shaped this nation. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying stories are often the ones that actually happened and that the most important histories are often the ones that were deliberately hidden. The past is not dead. It lives in our institutions, our assumptions, our unexamined beliefs about who we are. And sometimes when we dig deep enough, we find that the story we thought we knew was never the whole truth at all.